Hello, everyone. Welcome. I know we're going to have folks continuing to join over the next few minutes, but we have got a full agenda today, so I am going to just jump right into things. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. This is being recorded, so please mute yourself and choose whether or not you'd like to be on video. The recording of this seminar will be shared with all of our registrants later today via email. And we are going to have time for Q&A at the end of this seminar. If you didn't get a chance to submit your question with your registration, you are welcome to either put it in the chat throughout the presentations, or you can save it, and during that Q&A at the end, you can go off video and ask your question to our panelists. I am Jess Delfiaco. I'm the communications manager here at the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. We call it the Midwest CASC. And thank you so much for joining us for our April science seminar. The topic for today's seminar actually germinated from this year's Earth Day theme, which is Invest in Our Planet. And it's about businesses, governments, citizens coming together in partnership for their planet and investing in a green economy, both at the local level and beyond. So what we're going to talk about specifically today is financing climate adaptation in our region. We're going to talk about funding mechanisms that are available and the challenges and opportunities associated with them. But before we get to that conversation, you're going to hear briefly from me about kind of generally what the Midwest CASC does. And then you are going to hear from Ryan Berner, who is a member of a Midwest research project team, about a recent workshop that they held in Wisconsin. And then we will get to the meat of our discussion with our panelists in the latter half of today's seminar. So what is the Midwest CASC? The Midwest CASC is a partnership between the USGS and a consortium of 9 institutions throughout the Midwest. It's hosted by the University of Minnesota, which is where I am located here in St. Paul. And we are actually part of a network of regional CASCs throughout the country. And all of these CASCs work to produce science that can inform resource management efforts and help fish, wildlife, land, and people adapt to a changing climate. And very timely right now, through the CASCs, the USGS funds climate adaptation projects, and we are at the very beginning of the USGS project solicitation process for fiscal year 2024. If you're interested, you can send us an email at mwcasc@umn.edu to ask any questions. You can also take a look at our website or join our May 2nd webinar to get a little more insight into that process. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Ryan Berner. Ryan is a research wildlife biologist at the USGS Upper Midwest Environmental Sciences Center, and he's a co-PI on a Midwest CASC project on natural solutions to ecological and economic problems caused by extreme precipitation events in the Upper Mississippi River Basin. With that, Ryan, you can go ahead.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here, and thanks to Jess for the invitation. Is the screen showing up okay?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, great. And so as Jess said, I'm a research biologist at USGS here in La Crosse, Wisconsin. And we, myself and my co-authors, Kristen Baska, John Delaney, and Molly Van Apeldoorn, got together to host this workshop just this past month, and wanted to tell you a little bit about that. Okay, so as just mentioned, the workshop we called Nature-Based Solutions to Extreme Precipitation Events in the Upper Mississippi River Basin. And this was kind of a timely topic because many of us have experienced the damage and the destruction that can result from these extreme precipitation events, both along the Mississippi, but also in the headwaters. And in addition to those kind of acute effects, there are also these long-term effects of nutrient runoff and sedimentation and things like that. And there's a lot of inertia building behind nature-based solutions, which I'll tell you our definition in a minute. But we wanted to kind of, and in partnership with Olivia Liddy and the CASC as well, wanted to bring together a bunch of people who kind of knew about different aspects of this problem and these solutions, but really bring them together to exchange ideas, get everyone a little more up to speed, and then hopefully form some new collaborations as a result. And I'll get to what some of those might be at the end. But we got together for 3 days in Madison at a U.S. Forest Service facility, the Forest Products Lab, just about a month ago. And we had a variety of organizations involved. This was, of course, sponsored by the CASC, and we PIs were all at USGS as well. But there were a number of state and federal agencies. There were NGOs, universities, and some smaller community organizations that were involved. And we tried to bring in researchers, tried to bring in managers, social, economic sciences kind of people as well to address those aspects. And we developed this idea by having an advisory committee of 13 members from some of these organizations to make sure we were getting diverse perspectives included in who to invite. And we ended up with 18 speakers who presented on various aspects of this topic, but really the focus of the workshop was on discussion and generating ideas. And so to that end, we had 56 total participants from about 37 organizations. And here they are. Jess showed us this picture too, but that's the smiling group, at least the subset that were there at that moment. And let me just define nature-based solutions, because you may be wondering about that. So there are a lot of different definitions, and you could imagine kind of a very inclusive or a more narrow exclusive view of nature-based solutions. We took a fairly wide view. So it's essentially any kind of sustainable practices that include natural features or processes built into the environment. So it doesn't exclude things that involve engineering, but it just it makes sure that everything we're talking about kind of takes advantage of some natural features. And that's because these solutions can be more effective. It's also because they can have side benefits, maybe as wildlife habitat, in addition to, for example, dealing with runoff. So that's kind of where we were going. What did we focus on? Well, first, just getting a handle on climate projections, what we know, and with how much certainty about the future, what the impacts are and are likely to be, what different counties and cities and farmers are doing to adapt at different scales, and then finally some of the economics and social science policy stuff of adaptation. Those were our focal points. And as I mentioned, we had a number of speakers, so kind of giving us information and getting us thinking about certain topics. Then we also had an excellent facilitator who deserves a lot of credit for this workshop, and that's Brian Stenquist. And he really is a master of getting people, especially in such a large group, to think about things, talk about things, and then bring those ideas out to the whole group. So he kind of guided us through this process in a workbook. It involved a lot of sticky notes and kind of small groups getting together and reporting back out, and ended up with different people's thoughts synthesized on these sticky notes. And so I'm not going to attempt to kind of summarize the main themes from those, but stay tuned for our final report, which will have, among other things, these transcribed and organized sticky notes. So you can see kind of the raw data of what these 56 people came up with in a few days, which is going to be really cool. So some of the discussion topics that were kind of brought out as a part of this process were about impacts. They were about what nature-based solutions people thought would work in a given system that they weren't seeing implemented, what research questions we need to know about nature-based solutions, what are some of the barriers, because in many cases, we know with climate adaptation in general, it's not as much a knowledge problem as it is a ability to get people to do things problem. Right? And then finally, what incentives are people aware of that can encourage this kind of work, and making sure the group was aware of all that. And also challenges with collaborations, and especially between organizations. which was part of our motivation for having so many organizations. So I'm just going to share about 3 slides of things that I found interesting that came out in some of these talks. And one of these is our expected total precipitation trends over the next 40 to 50 years. And of course, there are many different versions of this. This is a particular climate model that Trent Ford, who's an Illinois State climatologist, was talking about, but we have spring on the left, summer on the right, and future trends in precipitation. So the first thing that jumps out to me is kind of wetter spring for most of the region, those green and blue colors. And those little hash marks on there are uncertainty. So in an ensemble of models where there was less certainty. When we get over to summer, there's a lot more variety. There are areas that might be drier, areas that might be wetter, but there's also much more uncertainty in models. And so I'm not up to speed on every version of climate models available, but this was just kind of a take-home message for me about how different seasons can have different effects and different levels of certainty for the Midwest. Something else we talked about were prairie strips as kind of one example of agricultural practices that reduce runoff when done correctly and combined with other complementary practices, and obviously could have a lot of side benefits for pollinators, for grassland birds. So that was a cool nature-based solution if you're looking for an example. Also learned about some more engineering heavy, but still nature-based by our definition, farm water runoff methods. So ways of dealing with and recycling water in agriculture that keep this water from shooting downstream immediately and carrying a lot of things with it that we don't want to leave the fields. We also learned about this Iowa Watershed Approach out of the University of Iowa. A few slides here courtesy of Larry Weber. And what they've done is experimentally in some watersheds implemented a lot of nature-based solutions and actually monitored what happens, what's the effect. So this flow on the right, it's looking at downstream stream flow in a particular system, and it's kind of pre and post nature-based solution implementation with the same amount of rainfall. And it's kind of like the COVID flattening the curve thing, right? Where you want to stretch this runoff out over a longer period of time so the system isn't overwhelmed in a short time. And that's kind of this black versus red line on this plot. So these nature-based solutions have reduced that runoff flow peak. And what they've done in Iowa then is they have some models that they can run for much of the state and make predictions about if we did this or that with land cover, with other modifications, how would we affect downstream flow. So it's a pretty cool project. If you're not familiar with it, check it out. Now, a big part of this workshop, as I said, it was not just to absorb information, but it was really to form new collaborations and hopefully develop some projects. And so we're actually supporting some projects that are new collaborative projects that are coming out of this workshop, and we haven't selected those, but kind of some of the themes that are coming up as we're discussing those are assessing ways to assess and value nature-based solutions. So how effective are they and what's their value? How do we prioritize and evaluate one particular solution, which is floodplain reconnections, giving rivers more room to flow? Kind of identifying policy incentives and disincentives from the perspectives of people who would be implementing nature-based solutions. And then also exploring ways to better communicate nature-based solutions to, for example, farmers and landowners. So those are some directions we may be going over the next couple months. And I've also been telling everyone about this nature-based solution funding source. So a lot of people have found this to be useful. And one great thing about this website, there is a lot of funding available right now for nature-based solutions. And there's this eligibility drop-down bar, which is really nice. You're not sorting through a bunch of grants and opportunities that don't apply to you. So you can use that and just NWF nature-based solutions. If you Google you can find that. And that's all I have. I'd be happy to take any quick questions and pass it back to Jess. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. As I said, you're also welcome to drop questions in the chat if you think of any for Ryan. We are gonna, if I can pull up my slide and share it, maybe. We are gonna switch over to talking with our speakers. There we go. Jessica, go ahead.
Well, hi, everybody. I'm Jessica Hellman. I am the director of the consortium for the Midwest CASC here at the University of Minnesota, the Institute on the Environment. And I have the great pleasure of engaging two speakers with us today to talk about a variety of content and notions in financing climate change adaptation. We're going to talk about policy. We're going to talk about partnerships. We're going to talk about ways of approaching and thinking creatively about where the resources for climate change adaptation are going to come from. We have two presenters. Each one is going to present for about 10 minutes, I believe, and then the three of us will have a conversation. I've got some questions ready to go, and I know that Jess is going to monitor the chat window, so anything you might want to like to ask our two presenters, please feel free to chime in there. I'm going to introduce them as they speak. So I'll introduce our first presenter first, and then introduce our second before she begins her remarks. And I'll point out that these two presenters come from organizations that are part of the Midwest CASC Consortium, Indiana University, and the Nature Conservancy. So we're grateful they make time to be with us today. So my first introduction is for John Applegate, professor of law at Indiana University. He also has served, in addition to being a law faculty member, he was IU's executive vice president for university academic affairs and has served as interim provost for IU Bloomington. He teaches and writes on environmental and administrative law. Among many things that he has done over his career, he's been particularly active in serving on several study committees for the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and served on its Nuclear and Radiation Studies Board. And in 2020, the National Academies named him a National Associate. Fun fact, you might recognize, those of us who are close to the USGS, you might recognize the name Applegate. I understand that John's brother is David Applegate, the current USGS director. So that's a really nice connection here to the CASC as well. So John, I'm going to turn it over to you to share some thoughts, and then we'll turn to our second speaker, Viv.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And indeed, being Dave's older brother is perhaps the biggest achievement I have, as I'm more than happy to remind him at the drop of a hat. And sometimes he even agrees. But in any event, yeah, so I always get a huge kick out of seeing the USGS logo on this, and quite apart from the familial relationship, it's those science-based agencies of the federal government really perform an incredibly important service at just a remarkably high level of talent and skill and following the science. And gosh, we need that certainly in an area like climate change. Well, I'm the lawyer in the family, so I'm going to focus on those aspects of it, and particularly on the context of the Inflation Reduction Act. As probably most everyone on this call or in this conference know, that's a bit of a misnomer. While it was, I'm sure, authentically designed to fight inflation, it is also the major piece of climate legislation ever, really. It was signed by President Biden on August 16th of 2022. And it contains a remarkable range of provisions to address climate change in a lot of ways. My takeaway message really is that there are two features that make the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, as I'm told we're supposed to call it, particularly important and useful for this seminar. First, it uses indirect regulation, that is subsidy rather than trying to control behavior directly, including tax credits and grants. So resources that are available, that's significant. And secondly, it embraces compromise or transitional measures that in the past, in the fairly recent past, have been widely shunned by people concerned about climate change as being insufficiently rigorous or showing insufficient commitment to addressing climate change. And that would include a focus on adaptation. So those two features, I think, are particularly important for CASC and Indiana's Environmental Resilience Institute and other such groups. So let me say a couple of words about indirect regulation. I kind of think of this as some kind of sadistic law exam question. That is, it would be like telling your students in environmental law that they have to figure out how to reduce greenhouse gases by 40% by 2030, but you can't require anybody to reduce emissions. You can only use non-prescriptive tools. And it has to be money leaving the government, not fees that are going to the government. So that's quite a challenge. And you just have to admire the scope and projected impact given how constrained their toolkit was. I'd give them an A for it. The estimates are that with this set of incentives, it will make major reductions in greenhouse gases, probably closer to the Paris targets than Build Back Better would have been, the original effort along these lines. And to do this, it meant that IRA uses a wide range of tools. The biggest one, and really where the big money is in tax credits. And whoever figured out the idea of these multi-tier tax credits, you have to do one thing and to get some of the tax credit, but take it further to get all of it, I think gets an A+. I think it's a really brilliant mechanism, and it will be interesting to see if it really works as one hopes it does. So tax credits, loans are a very powerful tool because it lets you reuse the money that you're investing once the first projects are repaying. There are direct investments of various kinds. There's support for state level activity, something that I think will be important in a litigation context as more and we will see challenges to state activities. It supports the SEC disclosure rules, and you'll see that there's been a lot of interest in that, but IRA will support, at least at the federal level, that happening. And really, there are only two areas where you have much significant regulation of a typical type. First of all, methane has a fee attached to it, so not even a cap, a fee, and there is the reinstituting of the oil tax or the tax on oil to support the Superfund. So all of these efforts were designed in the first place, or this whole technique of indirect regulation was a technique to limit opposition. It has the negative virtue, if you want to put it that way, of not being regulation. And it creates breadth of support by spreading wealth. both geographically and between citizens and industry. But it has some other positive virtues if you want to think about it. First of all, even though it's not written into law, I think it could have greater longevity simply because the taste for using this kind of federal support will only grow. I mean, you think about price supports of various kinds, and you see how those become embedded. It's also more certain of implementation. It doesn't have to go through the cost benefit analysis ringer that much of regular regulation has to do. It doesn't have the same procedures, legal procedures required, or the delay that occurs through even standard informal rulemaking. It lets the federal government get around recalcitrant states and even public utilities commissions, because much of the funding goes to municipalities and individual organizations and even individuals. They don't need to go through another political process. And it creates flexibility by giving the people who are making use of these credits and other forms of support the opportunity to do the kinds of work that we just heard described that will undoubtedly make it better and more effective. And then a final virtue is that it supports economic development. We all know that that clean technologies are not simply some terrible drag on the economy. In fact, they can support them very strongly. And that's just what many of these credits and other kinds of subsidies do. So that's sort of the broad picture of it in the first instance, or the first feature. The second, and I will wrap up very quickly here because I want to give others a chance and get questions. But first of all, the transition technologies cover a huge range of potential activities and potential things that are supported. And it includes support for a number of what are probably, hopefully, I would say, transitional approaches or technologies that in the past have been thought of as distractions or even bad ideas, but are part of an all hands on deck approach that the Biden administration has taken. Maybe the most controversial, or maybe second most controversial, is carbon capture. That's still an emerging technology. It's not clear to me that that's a long-term solution, but IRIS certainly supports it. The most controversial, at least historically, has been nuclear, which gets a huge amount of support from this and the bipartisan infrastructure legislation with production tax credits and other ways of supporting it. It's very clear that there is going to need to be some kind of transitional baseload energy support or source, and this will be one of them. Energy storage is going to be important for the long-term move to primarily electrical power. Biofuels, huge issue in the Midwest, especially as you get farther toward the Great Plains. Oil and gas leasing, again, transitional, and you can see that might be might be controversial. But the big one, and what I will close with, is adaptation or resilience. For a very long time, those who were concerned about climate change were skeptical of investing in adaptation, seeing it as taking away from going after mitigation, that is, going after the source. But as time and carbon density has increased, carbon density in the atmosphere has increased, it's clear that we need to look both at mitigation and adaptation. And the IRA legislation addresses that in any number of ways, from the urban development appropriations, energy appropriations, public lands, and environmental appropriations of various kinds. There is a great deal of funding for adaptation, again, as was just being described, and the opportunities to do that in a flexible and effective way based on the science, I think, will be very important. And just one final word about this, which is a huge theme in IRA is environmental justice or climate justice, maybe in this particular situation. And that's not only an important and valuable feature of IRA, but I think you can think of environmental justice as a resilience or an adaptation issue, because unless we can build strength and equity across all kinds of communities, we are not really going to be addressing adaptation effectively overall. So that is the big picture that I wanted to convey. I think Jess has a slide at some point with a number of different sources for grants and loans and other fundings that are maintained by various departments, and that is probably the best place to go for those resources. But I will stop now and hand it back to Jessica.
Yes, there's many Jesses and many Jessicas here.
Just to say,
I had no idea who it was. I just guessed that name.
I will share that slide later in the show, and we'll also share those resources out via email to everybody who registered after. Thanks, John.
And before we move to our second esteemed presenter, John, there is a question if you want to say something more about carbon capture and storage and the controversy associated with that. That was one specific question coming in to the chat.
It's a great question. Carbon sequestration and storage, there are a number of ways that it can be done, and a number of points in an industrial process that it can be done. But the idea is that you capture the carbon emissions and then sequester them in some place where they will stay put. And there are a number of different technologies that have been suggested for doing it, but I mean, think of it as putting one is to bury it in a in some form deep in the ground. And there are, I guess, a couple of questions about it. One is, does it work at scale? And that's still, I think, a work in progress. Another is, even if it works now, how long will that sequestration last? Because the idea is it doesn't make a whole lot of difference if you're just shifting when that emission occurs. I mean, I suppose if you shift it 1,000 years and we're using, I don't know, star energy or fusion or something, then maybe just shifting time would work. But really, it needs to be a kind of forever thing. And then the final one is, does it make economic sense? And I think that's going to be the big challenge. Now, if you're talking about a transitional technology, the fact that it doesn't, that you need to subsidize it to kind of get to the next stage might well make sense. So I don't want to say that CCS is a terrible idea, but it's still very much in development. And the concern has always been that you can invest a great deal in CCS, but you could take the same money and much more effectively invest it in other technologies and other actions.
Great, thank you, John. Certainly for our audience, carbon capture in the form of, say, photosynthesis and storing in forests and agricultural soils and other contexts, and thinking about how we stack that with adaptation and resilience building, is really important. And I think sometimes before we think about the technological solutions that are carbon capture, we really also need to look to our natural ecosystems too. So
Can I
many
just
different
say
exciting
amen to
dimensions.
that is exactly right.
Okay, I'm looking for Viv. Our
Right
second.
here.
Okay, great, thank you. And I think we're going to share some slides for you, right? So I'm going to
correct.
introduce you quickly and then turn over the mic to you. So Viv Bennett, we are very happy to have with us today, the Director of Protection and Conservation Strategies at the Nature Conservancy. So a few little pieces of information about Viv. She is responsible for the protection of over 16,000 acres of land and 3,000 acres of referred acquisitions. Importantly, she's the co-lead on 2 large-scale floodplain and freshwater demonstration projects in the Mississippi River Basin. So actual places where we're putting adaptation and resilience management into practice. Particularly pertinent to today's conversation, Viv has also worked with the global reinsurance industry to promote economic benefits of nature-based solutions, specifically with respect to flooding. And some other things she does, she works with future leaders to nature by creating and managing the Nature Kin network as well. So I'd like to turn it over to you, Viv. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jessica. And apologies for being off of video. I've had connectivity issues today, but the voice is the more important part anyway. So thank you, Jess, for advancing slides. And thank you, everybody, for coming to this meeting today for me to talk a little bit about the reinsurance industry and our work so far. Just so we're all on the same page, most of us are familiar with the retailers of the insurance industry. Those are the companies that we buy insurance from. But the reinsurance industry, however, is that part of the insurance sector that buys the risk off the retailers. So they pool all the risks together, and then the global, there's only a handful of them, they're global, and they buy the risk from the retailer. So it's a different level of the insurance industry. In particular, I have worked most closely with Munich Re over the past 6 or 7 years. And in the course of those conversations, we decided to use one of TNC's land-based projects that I and fellow colleagues, and also I see Matt Vitello is on here. So Matt, good to see you. And he also was part of that team. We were working independently on a land-based project that we decided, Munich Re and I decided to use as a case study to see what kind of risk reduction economic benefits could arise from the adoption of a nature-based solution that was addressing repetitive flooding. So we'll talk a little bit about that. It's commonly known as the L536, which is a large-scale levee setback. That was the nature-based solution that was applied on the Missouri River. And then, as Brian mentioned, you all know what we consider nature-based solutions. But again, just to reiterate, they are smart development strategies. So they do have some engineering component potentially, but the difference is they work with nature, not against nature. And when they're designed and developed appropriately, they're also both a protection and cost-effective approach that provide multiple benefits, ranging anything from habitat to recreation, to a community's ability to rebound after a disaster, which was a really key part for our L536 study. And so really what we're here to focus on today is the disaster reduction benefits that nature provides, and then the possible next stages of the work of with the reinsurance industry. Jess, if you don't mind going to the next slide, that'd be great. Thank you. So these are 2 examples. The one on the left is the L536 large-scale levee setback that I and Matt and others worked on. That is located in the northwestern corner of the Missouri on the lower Missouri River. And it was actually championed and started by the local drainage and levee district with full landowner participation, where over 1,000 acres of floodplains and another 400 acres of wetlands were created. This is a very new project. It was started, the team was pulled together in 2019, and then the work continues to today. The full levee was constructed in March of 2021, but the work is not completed yet. So it's still considered an ongoing project. The most important thing, though, the most relevant thing here is that by making room for the river, the destructive velocity of the floodwaters will be lessened as water expands outward, and taking the pressure off both upstream and downstream infrastructure. So it is benefiting not only its current footprint, but also what's before it and the river, as well as what's after it on the river. And then on the right-hand side, that is featuring a different and older project where, expanding room for the river, that economic benefit has actually been documented by the National Weather Service in Washington State. And they've had more time to collect data. Specifically, by allowing the river room to expand, the Puyallup River now has a lower flood risk after the nature-based solution was put into place. And this project again resulted in greater floodplain area being connected to the river, lowering the river height during times of high river flow. So between these two projects, there's plenty of opportunities to use nature to expand the river. Indeed, in the lower Missouri, there are another 14 pinch points along that river that could benefit from upstream and downstream setbacks or river expansions. And so we're just beginning to study the economic benefits for riverine ecosystems and communities. And the L536 will be one of many project sites that will be included in the analysis. What we did find in the joint paper that Unique Re and TNC did, that is that there's significant economic savings that can be had when you couple with the decreased cost on insurance premiums for a community, when you couple the nature-based solutions with community-wide flood resiliency insurance coverage. Indeed, in the study, we found out that there was about 55% reduction in the cost. So what is interesting and what is kind of challenging about this work is that the savings occur after the risk has been reduced. And so what we have to do now, and this is part of the phase 2, what we have to do now is find the savings transfer mechanism that will prepay, so to speak, the nature-based solution that reduces the risk enough for the savings to pay for the risk reduction. It's all about timing. It's a timing issue. And like I said, that's the next phase of our work. Next slide, please, Jess. But what we do know, and this is what is motivating us, is that adopting nature-based solutions actually do reduce costs and risk. TNC and others have used scientific modeling to measure the protection and cost effectiveness that investments in things like coastal wetlands restoration, enhancement of oyster reefs, coral reefs, and mangroves effectively reduce the wave impacts and help absorb floodwaters. On the left-hand side, that was about with the Hurricane Irma, over $1.5 billion was saved in avoided damages because of these nature-based solutions that affected 626,000 people. And then on the right-hand side, we did find out that like with the Hurricane Sandy in 2012, coastal wetlands in the Northeast prevented more than $625 million in flood damage. So it's a prevention thing, in addition to being able to rebound faster. And then slide 4, please. And then the multiple benefits. So of course, we talked a little bit about the benefits of nature-based solutions and investing in your planet, investing in the multi-benefits. They're well-researched, they're measured and documented. And just to name a few, there's the water and air quality benefits, greenhouse gas emission reduction benefits, wave attenuation and erosion reduction benefits. There's habitat benefits to fish, animals, and plants, recreational and access to nature, and general aesthetics are some of the human considerations. And then, of course, all in addition to the flood and wildlife risk reduction benefits. In our study, we found out, of course, there's insurance savings benefits, but also the ability for a community to rebound. When you have some of these extra benefits that are aesthetic or recreational or economic, then a community is more likely to come back, but in a different fashion, in a different manner, but they will come back. What we are seeing right now without having these nature-based solutions factored in is many communities during multiple flood events are actually picking up and leaving. They're never coming back. So this is one of those things that a community is able to rebound faster with incorporation of nature-based solutions and insurance. So in summary, the phase 1 of our reinsurance work was completing the case study. And that, again, it showed that a community could save significant insurance premium costs by adopting both the community-wide insurance policy coupled with the nature-based multi-benefit solutions, such as the levee setback. And then the second part is now that we're looking to start phase 2. and would appreciate any leads that you have that you could send our way. And this would be basically what we want to do is identify one or more communities that, after suffering repetitive flood losses, are looking to manage water and land differently. And we would like to work collaboratively with them to help co-design the savings transfer mechanism. And so examples of those are bond issuances, revolving funds, letters of credit, and I would imagine mechanisms that we still have yet to create. So if you have any communities that you know have that interest in, one, being tired of the same old, and then two, wanting to try something new and be willing to sit at the table to try something new, we would really appreciate those leads. That's it for me.
That's great. Thank you. You have just hit on such a critically important notion for all of the work that we do here at the CASC, which is the science so far has done a nice job of articulating what those economic benefits are, Viv, but the fact that they occur as avoided costs or pay dividends over a long time horizon, how do you move that expense up to the capital investment stage, or the upfront, to cover that upfront cost and the expense? So I'm so grateful that, you would raise that financing question. So I'm going to ask both of you, and I don't know, Jess, if there's a way that you can, I guess Viv is off screen still. Is there a way to highlight both of them on screen? I don't know.
Let me see. I can go off screen and then be hidden.
Well, as you figure that out, I'm wondering, actually, I'm going to take Viv's question about who might be interested in doing this, and thinking about creative ways like bonding and other issues or letters of credit to finance these. And I'm going to say, John, for those of us who haven't yet read the whatever hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages in the IRA, are there mechanisms in there for precisely the kind of project? I know it's mostly they're tax incentives, so that means they're for private industry or for individuals. But what are there intersection points between what the IRA financial incentives are and the kinds of projects, maybe for individual landowners, that Viv is describing? Does that question make sense?
It does. You have to look both at IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure law,
Okay.
which has some incentives there as well. And I don't have a really good answer directly to that, but I think that you can. There are various programs, including loan programs, that might solve the financing problem. In other words, as Viv is describing it, she's exactly right, that these are things that have long-term paybacks. And so expecting people to do that individually, or even communities and sometimes even states to do it individually, is a big ask. As anyone who has contemplated putting solar panels on their roof knows, there's even with a major tax credit for it, you still have to kind of take a deep breath and say, well, I'm going to get only so much direct benefit out of it, because the capital investment up front is not going to pay for itself for 10 or 15 years. And home ownership being what it is, most people will not still own the house at that point, right? Mm-hmm. So that's a really helpful place for government to step in and help mm-hmm. people to get over that hump. And it's even more true. With, say, solar panels, you can see it on your electric bill. But when it's truly avoided costs, and this is just what Viv was saying, when it's truly avoided costs, you never see them, right, in any concrete way. So it is much harder to get people to invest in it.
Viv, do you see in these new federal big programs, infrastructure, the Inflation Reduction Act, do you see new opportunities for financing when you say we need to be creative in this financing mechanisms? Have you been looking at that?
Yeah, we have. There isn't anything direct, you know, I mean, we are truly creating something new. The closest thing is, you know, we're tweaking things that exist. So things like state revolving funds potentially could be used. Really what you need is to have one starting point where it seeds the work. And then after that, when you finish the first one, all those savings that are captured in go to the next project and to the next project. So it's one of those things that pays it forward. And so there isn't anything quite like that right now, unless you go higher than one municipality footprint at a time, which is why it lends itself better to, you know, multi-county regional councils of development or statewide projects or even regional projects. And so I really believe in starting local with the community and building out as opposed to top-down policy where you have to figure out the bumps later on. You actually figure out the bumps as you go and you build it up so it works really well by the time it gets to the top. And so that's why we're trying to approach it that way. But there isn't a perfect fit yet.
And what about the fact that sometimes these avoided costs, like when you're looking at, say, Mississippi River flooding, eventually the river will flood, right? I mean, some of these are extreme events. You don't know exactly what the consequences will be or how likely it is. And thus it's even sometimes hard to calculate what the avoided costs might be. Have you encountered that or thought about that in, I mean, especially when we're making a scientific case about the economic application of these types of approach, we're sort of averaging over a bunch of sites and saying that it's economically advantageous. But if I'm investing in my particular project, how do I know that I'm going to have experienced that economic harm?
I think that's a good question for engineers. You know, I do believe it goes into like the flood storage and what's the capacity that it can hold, and then making that an economic, translating that to economic figures. There are people who are doing that. It's very complex. You know, I think to the question that Olivia has in chat, what I have been told by engineers is that the coastal flooding is actually easier to figure out than riverine flooding. Because the energy is coming from one source, it's coming from the waves in, whereas the riverine flooding, you know, you got it from the rain, you got it from upstream, you got it downstream, you got it sideways, you have it from underground infrastructure that is failing and bubbling back up, you know, so there's it's much more complicated. And I guess a newer science, I don't know, I think that's what I've been told. So yeah, so it's harder to calculate that yet. We don't know that yet.
It also makes sense why things like reinsurance care so much about these adaptation and resilience strategies, because they're actually holding the whole portfolio. So if they could reduce risk, they don't need that certainty necessarily of the particular place or the particular project that's going to get hit. If they're offering, you know, if they're reinsuring across the industry or across a wide geography, risk reduction is beneficial for them. So I think there's also something about, I mean, this is the role for government, about financing being borne by the entity that cares about the sort of distribution of risk, if that makes any.
Yes, you're exactly right. I mean, that's the reinsurance industry has actually created a new product, and it's in response to climate change. That's what I've been told. And it's because in the olden days, you know, the asset owner, how well they manage that asset determined their insurance premium and their level of risk they were taking on. Now with climate insurance or climate, you know, it doesn't matter how well you take care of your house or how well you take care of your car. The next time a flood comes in, everybody's house is affected, everybody's car is affected. And so now all of a sudden the insurance has to go up to a whole level that's community wide. And so they created a new product just for that purpose. And so that's what we are trying to, the reinsurance industry is working on the product, and then TNC is working on the nature-based solutions. And by putting them together, that's where you get that extra benefit.
Well, and it seems to me there's also some research opportunities here when we're looking for new mechanisms, right? And John, we're thinking about what are policies that are meeting a gap in the way in which we're managing landscapes or the incentives that people have for pursuing resilience and adaptation. And so I know that our science community, our scholarly community who tunes into these is thinking about what kinds of interesting questions do we need to ask in order to design those new financial and policy strategies. Do either of you have thoughts on that? What do you think would be good research questions, or what should we be studying that would actually help us to come up with new financing and policy strategies?
Well, I think the more closely and definitely one can tie the potential consequences to the protection mechanisms is very important. I mean, well, I'll just speak for myself. I mean, I've been very frustrated that at how much resistance long-term strategies now have. There is a long tradition of taking investing in protective actions or legislation. I mean, if you think about rivers, it's putting up all those levees, right?
Yeah.
Not enough thought as to what that means downstream or
Right.
its other consequences. But you look at a levee and you say, well, I've got water here, I'm here, and if I build this big wall, it makes intuitive sense that that will protect me from it, whether it does or not. But think about vaccines, right? I mean, we have an amazing track record in this country on vaccination, which depends on taking a certain amount of leap of faith that you will be protected in the future should you be exposed to smallpox or something like that. And now we have this very short-term thinking, there's a risk here, what's in it for me? And not even to go into various more, out there theories about, what they put in COVID vaccines and so on. And that's, I think, one of the big humps to get over. If it's not just a wall, right, you won't, it doesn't feel as intuitive, even though, I mean, again, I think Viv and I think the scientists make a really great case that pulling back the wall, giving the river more room might actually be much more effective, and then have all of these really good benefits in addition to it in terms of restoring wetlands and so on.
Collective risk reduction. Viv, I'm going to turn it back to Jess. Do you have, but I want to give you the last quick word. Thoughts on research or things that we should be studying or investigating?
Well, Olivia put in chat that that is one of the requirements, is evaluate, quantify the potential of natural lands. And that is definitely something that we're using for like the L536 study and other riverine projects, is to measure that. So thank you for putting that in there, Olivia.
All right, thank you, Viv and John and Jessica, for that great conversation. As promised, here's a list of various funding resources that John and Viv both contributed to. I'll be sending this out by email as well. And then quick reminder that our next seminar is going to be on May 22nd. I hope you can join us then. If you have another minute before you hop off, I am going to pop up a quick poll for you to tell us how we did today. Thanks again to our speakers and all of you for joining us here.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.